As early as June 29, 1941, the Council of People's Commissars of the USSR and the Central Committee of the All-Union Communist Party declared that in the war with Nazi Germany imposed on us, the question of the life and death of the Soviet state, of whether the peoples of the Soviet Union should be free or fall into enslavement, was being decided. In this letter, the Central Committee of the party and the Soviet government warned party, Soviet, trade union, Komsomol organizations and their leaders against complacency and carelessness, demanded to quickly and decisively restructure all their work on a war footing. Special attention was paid to strengthening the rear of the Red Army. It was proposed to subordinate all activities to the interests of the front, to ensure enhanced work of all enterprises, to explain to the workers their duties and the situation, to organize protection of factories, power stations, bridges, telephone and telegraph communications, and to fight against all disorganizers of the rear, deserters, panickers, rumor mongers, to destroy spies, saboteurs, enemy parachutists. Why was so acute during the Great Patriotic War to strengthen the home front, to restore order in it, to mobilize all the forces of the people to defeat the enemy? Because the success of the Red Army depended entirely on the state of the Soviet rear. Starting the war against us, the leaders of Hitler's Germany staked not only on tanks, airplanes and guns. They hoped to undermine our state and from within, to disorganize the Soviet rear, to deprive the front of the most essentials. In the disorganization of the rear of the Red Army, a special role was assigned to intelligence and counterintelligence agencies. On the eve of the war, the enemy's intelligence activities were aimed at collecting a variety of data on the military capabilities of the Soviet Union, to create a fifth column, to ensure a surprise attack on the USSR. In the course of the war, intelligence and subversive activities on our territory and in the rear of the active armies acquired even greater scope. Enemy agents managed to get for the German command some information about the Soviet troops at the front, their immediate rear, and to carry out a number of sabotage actions. Thus, in the first weeks of August 1941, several sabotage actions were committed on the Kurov and Oktyabrskaya railroads. Basically, in the frontline zone acted Hitler's military intelligence Abwehr. The Abwehr created on the Soviet-German front quite a wide network of intelligence agencies. They included the main headquarters valley. With its subordinate numerous intelligence, sabotage, terrorist and counterintelligence Abwehr commandos, special headquarters Sonderstaff Russia to coordinate the activities of various agencies for economic espionage and punitive measures, intelligence and sabotage schools, special camps where agents were selected and recruited. A special role was played by military units of the Abwehr. Division Brandenburg 800, Regiment Kurfürst Battalions Bergmann and Nachtigall, whose soldiers were disguised in the uniforms of Soviet soldiers, state security and police officers. Detachments and groups of these units were tasked with penetrating into the nearest rear of the Soviet army, seizing crossings and important military facilities, blowing up communications, sowing panic. In 1971, in the magazine Moscow, was published the diary of S. Vladimirov, one of those who went into service to the Nazis. In his notes, the former Gestapo investigator also told about the activities of the Sonderstab Russia, with some of whose employees he had to closely encounter. After the war, S. Vladimirov, who asked the editorial board not to use his real surname, appeared in South America. All this time he kept the notebooks he kept while working for the Gestapo. Now he decided to make them public. The editorial board preface notes his commentary, which states why this publication appeared, but the main thing is not in the personality of SS. Vladimirov, and not that. Vladimirov, and not in what prompted him to break his vow of silence on the slope of years, but in the content of the notes. They shed light on one of the dirtiest pages in the history of the NTS. About 500 people served the purposes of the Sonderstab Russia. They were engaged in intelligence and punitive activities in the occupied territory of the Soviet Union. It was an auxiliary apparatus of the German war machine, but dangerous by its bitterness and overzealousness. At the head of the Sonderstab was Colonel Rydzio Smyslovsky, former chief of counterintelligence of the Rangel Army. The heads of the departments were Colonel Shapovalov, a member of the leadership of the so-called Organization People's Labor Union Wurgler, a former Tsarist Lieutenant Bondarevsky. One of them, Wurgler, telling the author of the diary about his life, said that in the June days of 1941, the General Directorate of Imperial Security of Germany negotiated with the NTS about participation in the war against the Soviet Union. Since that time, each of us and the entire organization has kept pace with the Gestapo. As part of the Sonderstab Russia, this organization served the Nazis faithfully and faithfully. Brandenburg 800 was a special subversive unit formed in Brandenburg in 1940. It had several companies, intended for different countries with which Hitler's Germany intended to enter the war. But a special place was given to the company that was to operate in the territory of the Soviet Union. After some time, the battalion Brandenburg 800 was transformed into a regiment, and then became a division. On Soviet territory entered the Special Purpose Regiment, which was directly subordinate to the head of one of the departments of Hitler's intelligence. Among the tasks facing this formation showed the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg, one of the agents of Hitler's Secret Service E. Stolz included the capture of important objects, mainly military, and their retention until the approach of the advance units of German troops. During the preparation of the German attack on Russia, the command of the Regiment Brandenburg also dealt with items of uniforms and weapons of the Red Army and formed separate units of Germans who spoke Russian. In the first weeks and months of the war, saboteurs from Brandenburg and other similar sabotage and intelligence organizations, cooperating with their advancing troops, penetrated our rear. They took advantage of the fact that when the Red Army units were retreating from the fighting, the inhabitants of many towns and villages often left together with them. This flow of refugees, evacuation of wounded Soviet soldiers from the front, and used Hitler's intelligence to send their agents, spies, bombers in the rear of the active armies. Hitler's intelligence, as it is known, failed to fulfill its tasks completely. Zapravlia's fascist Germany did not take into account neither the moral and political unity of the Soviet people, nor the strength of our rear, nor the strength of our refe, nor the strength and capabilities of the Soviet state security agencies. The enemies miscalculated. True to their patriotic duty, the Soviet people showed high vigilance, exposed and destroyed enemy spies and their accomplices of all stripes, no matter how cleverly they disguised themselves. With the outbreak of war, the Communist Party and the Soviet government took a number of effective measures to reorganize the state security agencies, internal troops of the NKVD, and the militia for wartime conditions. Much was also done to mobilize Soviet people to fight enemy agents, saboteurs and parachutists. Strict order was introduced in the areas declared under martial law. Huge work in this direction in the rear of the active army did border battalions and regiments, as well as troops of the NKVD. The regulation of March 13, 1942 on the border troops of the USSR, protecting the rear of the active Red Army, states, protection of the rear of the fronts is organized by order of the military councils of the fronts and is carried out by military units and rear institutions of the NKO and specially allocated for this purpose border troops of the NKVD of the USSR. The frontier troops of the NKVD protecting the rear of the active Red Army are entrusted with combating sabotage, espionage and banditry, with small detachments and groups of the enemy infiltrating to get into the rear. In special cases, by decision of the Military Council of the Front, the frontier troops of the NKVD can be entrusted with the protection of communications in certain areas. The composition of the NKVD border troops to protect the rear of the active Red Army on each front separately determined by the General Staff of the Red Army and the NKVD of the USSR. This is a brief history of the creation of the frontier troops to protect the rear of the front, which in fact guarded the mobile border from the Arctic Circle to the shores of the Black Sea. According to the order of the military councils of the fronts, the frontier units were assigned service lanes. As a rule, outposts of the first echelon were located on the rear lines of divisions, headquarters of battalions, regiments and outposts of the second line on the rear lines of armies. As on the border in peacetime, the rear guard units of the frontier troops deployed all kinds of border guards in the areas specified to them. Protection of the rear of the front was continuous both in time and space. In the zone of action of the frontier units, all local NKVD bodies and militia became operationally subordinate to the command of these units. In towns and villages, a frontier regime was introduced, which was established by the Military Council of the Front. All this was subordinated to one goal: the fight against enemy scouts, the defeat of Hitler's troops. Once, having visited the Central State Archive of the Soviet Army, I found a report of the headquarters of our 92nd Border Regiment from December 11th, 1941. It became known that in the area of the village of Plyshika, 60 kilometers from the village of Chernyanka, hides a group of unknown 11 people. The detachment under the command of Lieutenant Pajev detained this group in a special cache under a stack of straw. The report reminded about one episode which I would like to tell about. During the withdrawal of Soviet troops from the area of Volchansk and Belgorod between our and German defences, which ran along the western bank of the Seversky Donets, formed a no-man's land from 30 to 50 kilometers wide. In many villages that were in this strip between the rivers Oskol and Seversky Donets came the so-called powerlessness. Most of the Soviet and party bodies evacuated from the area. However, by December 1941, the front in the southwest direction stabilized, and the units of the 21st Army moved westward and took up the defense along the eastern bank of the Seversky Donets River. Thus, the no-man's land became ours again, and units of the 92nd Frontier Regiment, guarding the rear of the 21st Army, advanced. One day we received a report from the locals that during the period of powerlessness, a group dressed in the uniform of the Red Army went through the villages. It was led by a man in the uniform of a Soviet petty officer. By force of arms they took away food from the locals. We began to search for the unknown men. In one of the villages, the chairman of the village council and collective farm showed us a curious order posted in the neighbouring villages. The order stated that for resistance to the food supply, the two chairmen were sentenced to death by hanging, and their houses and property were to be burned. However, the execution of the sentence was prevented by the Red Army units that advanced to the banks of the Seversky Donets. Usually these strange people stayed in the neighbouring village, in the house of two women, where they had a party, said the chairman of the village council. Look for them there. At night we arrived in the village named. In the house that stood on the outskirts, the women confirmed that some unknown men dressed in Red Army uniforms had indeed come to them. They spoke German and Russian. The main man was dressed in the uniform of a Soviet petty officer. They did not ask the women for anything, only ordered them to cook them food. They'd come and then disappear for a few days. They'd come again and disappear again, and now they hadn't been there for a few days. Just behind the house where the two lonely women lived, there was a small forest, and then a field. We reasoned if those who pretended to be Red Army soldiers could not get behind the front line or rush to our deep rear, sooner or later they would show up, as hunger would make them come here. Having warned the women to behave and do everything as before our arrival, we set up ambushes and waited. At night, border guards Pokusa and Mashkin brought an unknown man to the house. The women recognized him as one of those who had visited them. After a short lock-up, the detainee told them where the others were hiding. The border guards surrounded the haystacks and offered the group of Hitler's agents to surrender. However, they responded to our ultimatum with fierce fire. When the shooting subsided a little, we fired a dozen smoke rockets from a rocket launcher into the opening of the bunker where the saboteurs were hiding. Soon voices came from underground, "Don't shoot, we surrender." At the preliminary investigation, it was established that the group was formed and thrown with a special task to the neutral strip, one of the intelligence centers of the Abwehr, operating on the Soviet-German front. The detainees told an officer of the relevant authorities about the circumstances of the mission and the essence of the assignment. One more similar case has been preserved in my memory. In the village, where our platoon was located, a teacher came running and reported that in the village of Kolomitsevo 5 unknown men in military uniform appeared and disappeared somewhere. The night was dark and snowy. The road was covered with snowdrifts. When the soldiers arrived at the place, they confirmed that they had seen the unknown men, but they did not know where they had gone. The head of the group, Lieutenant Pokusa, decided to go around the village to look for traces of those who had left. Border guard Machulinsky found deep dents behind the outskirts of the village, overcoming snow drifts, then losing and then again finding someone's footprints. Pokusa, Machulinsky, Mikhailenko and Ostrenko at the neighbouring village detained those about whom the woman spoke. The unknown persons were taken to the battalion headquarters, and then to the regimental headquarters, where they confessed to criminal purposes, with which they were thrown into our rear by Hitler's intelligence. Under what legends were mainly sent enemy agents to the front rear? Legends were simple and convenient. Separated from his unit, came out of the encirclement. After recovery in the hospital returns to the unit. Deserted from the front line or from a marching battalion. The specific method of transportation depended on the nature of the mission, the duration of stay in the Soviet rear. The chiefs of German intelligence considered such methods reliable, especially since the relevant documents were sometimes produced almost flawlessly, as they were often used true forms, certificates they were collected from the dead, taken from the captured. However, all this helped enemy spies and saboteurs badly. They were caught or destroyed, as a rule, before they had time to fulfill the tasks of their masters. Only during 3 months the units of our regiment in the rear of the 21st Army were neutralized several dozens of agents of Hitler's intelligence. Before the new 1942 year, it was possible to summarize some results of activity of frontier guards in the front line. With a good mood and with even greater hopes we met the new year. In a special order, the commander of the regiment, Major Wróblewski, thanked the soldiers of our platoon for selfless service to protect the rear of the 21st Army. The night from December 31st, 1941, to January 1st, 1942 caught us in the village of Kupina. In one of the empty houses where we settled, I congratulated the soldiers and commanders on the coming new year. To victory, friends. This toast was supported by everyone. According to the regulations that existed at that time, the soldiers were given 100 front grams for the holiday. Those who did not go on duty and could rest clinked iron mugs. At the beginning of 1942, the structure of the frontier regiments was slightly modified, taking into account the specifics of our service. Companies were transformed into outposts. The connection with citizens of frontline villages, local, party and state bodies became closer. Contacts with our military intelligence and counterintelligence increased. This increased the effectiveness of the fight against Hitler's spies and saboteurs in the rear of the Red Army. In January 1942, I was appointed chief of one of the outposts. Its political officer was 22-year-old junior political officer Ivan Ivanovich Goncharov, a former miner from the Moscow suburbs coal basin, who served in the border troops since 1938. The war caught him at one of the outposts of the 92nd Frontier Detachment. Goncharov participated in the battles near Peremyshl and near Uman. He was energetic, brave. Besides, as they say, he was a master of all hands. He sang, danced, played the harmonica. Ivan Ivanovich turned out to be a thoughtful and skillful political worker who instilled optimism and faith in the fighters in the victory over Hitler's evil. Another of my assistants was Lieutenant Garif Sadikovich Jamaldinov, who came from Kazan. He was the deputy chief of the outpost. Jamaldinov came to us from the NKVD internal troops. He was an impetuous, hot-tempered, exceptionally honest and brave man. You could rely on him in everything, entrust him with the most serious and dangerous business. He was with me almost until the end of the war. Then he was demobilized and went to his home in Tatarstan. About the same time we received an order to transfer cadre border guards to the 70th Army, which was composed of fighters and commanders of border troops and NKVD troops. This army then bravely fought at the Kursk Bulge in defensive and offensive battles. In the 70th Army in the beginning of 1942, and a few border guards of the 10th Outpost, with whom I experienced so much and in whom I was confident as in myself. Before parting we sat together, remembering our pre-war service at the outpost, the first battles, remembered our fallen comrades, wished each other to see the bright day of victory over fascism. It was a pity to part with former fighters, but what can you do? "Goodbye, Comrade Chief," said the border guards. "Maybe we'll see each other again?" Instead of those who had left the platoon, people called up from the reserve or frontline soldiers who were not fit for military service came to the platoon. With those who had already been in combat, it was easier. They knew how to use weapons, knew the requirements of military regulations and discipline. Some decorated their chests with battle orders and medals. These fighters, as they say, have already smelled gunpowder. Those who were drafted from the reserve, and these were people of different ages and professions, as a rule, had to be taught wisdom. It was not without mishaps. At that time we received new anti-tank grenades, and one day we settled down in the trench and started throwing grenades. Having shown how it should be done, I threw the grenade to the target. It seemed clear. The newcomers nodded their heads understandingly. The first to perform the exercise was the right flank fighter, who turned out to be Private Maliuk, a 50-year-old collective farmer from the Vinnytsia region, who stood out among the others with his enviable height. Fire at the enemy tank with one grenade. I commanded. But Maliuk, as if did not hear the command, stood motionless with a grenade raised in his hand. I repeated the command. Maliuk didn't move. Then I pulled the safety pin and again commanded fire. But the fighter seemed numb, he was pale, and his hand, which clutched the grenade handle, turned blue. I showed him to lie down at the bottom of the trench. Then I took Maliuk by the arm and pushed him forward with force. The grenade flew off 6 meters away. There was a strong explosion. The brushfire of the trench crawled towards us. Shaking off, Maliuk rose to his full giant height and, embarrassed, asked, "Comrade Senior Lieutenant, permit me again?" But the number of grenades was allocated exactly according to the number of people. And yet Maliuk was lucky. One of the former frontline soldiers asked, "Give my grenade, Comrade Senior Lieutenant, to Maliuk. I've already had enough of them." I knew that this fighter had been in combat since the first day of the war, and I allowed Maliuk to repeat the exercise. This time Maliuk threw a grenade, as they say, God give everyone. A little time passed. Private Maliuk learned not only to throw grenades perfectly, but also to do everything that our difficult and dangerous service required of him. We could only be glad that we got such a fighter. Soon all the other recruits joined the ranks. Before the beginning of the war, on the Carpathian border, our outpost was in the centre of the detachment. Now we were located on the left flank, at a considerable distance from the battalion and regimental headquarters. There was still no technical means of communication. The transmission of orders and reports was carried out by foot messengers. As on the frontier, each outpost had its own small economy. In essence, it was a steam-powered wagon, which carried ammunition, food and a boiler for cooking. Usually outposts were located in the neighbourhood of the rear organs of divisions. It facilitated supply. Empty buildings were selected to house the men. The room in the evening was illuminated by homemade lamps, which were not difficult to make. Artillery shells were filled with diesel oil. A flap of overcoat cloth was put into it. Here was a source of light. And although the diesel smoked enormously and the light was weak and dim, still it was a reliable way of illumination. The organizational restructuring that had begun brought changes in the command of the regiment. We all loved and respected Commissar Nikolai Akimovich Avdyukin left. He was appointed commissar of one of the rifle divisions. With it he went through the whole war. Then he was the secretary of the party commission in the group of Soviet troops in Germany. Retired, settled in the Moscow region, where he lived until his last hour. Instead of Avdyukin, Commissar became a former military commander of the Border Commandant's Office of the 92nd Border Guard Unit, Nikolai Ivanovich Tarakanov, a man of fighting and brave, knowing his business. The chief of staff of the regiment was changed. Instead of Major Kudryashov came the former commandant of the 93rd Border Guard, Major Zinovy Osipovich Blumin, who knew well the peculiarities of service of our troops. Major Blumin passed all the official steps. He was a private, petty officer, head of outpost, deputy commandant and commandant of the border section, commander of the border battalion. Zinovy Osipovich participated in many battles, including those near Popolnaya and near Horns. On March 3, 1942, the commander of our regiment, Major Fedor Ivanovich Vrublevsky, left. He, as he had combat experience in leading a border detachment in the early period of the war, among other commanders, was summoned to the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs and appointed to the Far East as the head of the border detachment. At that time the situation there was alarming. The possibility of an attack by imperialist Japan was not excluded. In 1944, after our troops reached the western border, Wróblewski was appointed chief of the Brest border detachment, and in this position he finished his service in the border troops. I learned about Major Wróblewski's departure from the regiment when I received a package delivered by a liaison officer of the outpost. It was in the village of Kupino. I was questioning the detainees when the border guard Pucianin appeared and reported, "Comrade Senior Lieutenant, you have a package." In the envelope was a party and combat characterization written on me by the regiment commander Major F.I. Wróblewski. The documents by which on the eve of the war one was accepted from candidates to party members disappeared. On leaving, Wróblewski remembered about it. It became both warm and sad that we did not have to say goodbye to this sensitive, warm-hearted man who was with us at the village of Korostov, where our baptism of fire took place, and in the forest near Galich during the skirmish with the enemy landing, and in Popoln, Elisavetovka, in Kanel Lubny. Everywhere Fyodor Ivanovich was where it was the most difficult and dangerous. The regiment from Wróblewski took our former chief of detachment, Major Bozy. In this position he was not long. Already at the end of April 1942, he handed over his duties to Major Blumin. After the crushing defeat of Nazi troops near Moscow and the failure of the plan of lightning war against the Soviet Union, Hitler's leadership did not give up its goals in this war. It still hoped to gain victory, to improve matters on the Soviet-German front. For this purpose, reserves were pulled up to the Eastern Front, regrouping of troops was carried out, the activity of fascist intelligence was intensified. The protracted war, which was not included at first in the plans of Hitler's leadership, caused a reorganization in the work of intelligence agencies. Now it was supposed to conduct active subversive work not only in the frontline areas, but also in the deep rear of our country. In February 1942, for these purposes, was created a special intelligence agency, Zeppelin VI, for which the directive of February 15, 1942, Himmler defined the direction of work to make political and moral decoding of the USSR to break the unity of the peoples of the USSR by propaganda to weaken the economic forces of the Soviet Union by sabotage, terror, and other means. Hitler's intelligence intensified its subversive activities in the frontline areas. With the help of sabotage, it tried to weaken the work of the rear organs of our divisions and armies at any cost, to disrupt the normal life of military enterprises working in close proximity to the front, to do harm by any means, not abhorring anything. In 1967, one of the issues of Week told how the Germans threw a large group of children on parachutes to the rear of the Red Army along the front line from Kalinin to Kharkov. The children were dressed in old clothes. In their torbes they had food and mines disguised as pieces of coal. They were supposed to plant them in the tenders of steam locomotives or coal depots at stations. Instead, however, the children came with parachutes and explosives to commanders of military units, the police, and state security agencies. These were mostly former orphanage children who had agreed in the sabotage school not to harm the Red Army and to surrender immediately after being thrown out. Soon Soviet counterintelligence liquidated the school in Kassel. All the children were transported to the Soviet rear. The extent to which Hitler's intelligence trained its personnel during this period can be evidenced by such figures. In 1942, in special schools and courses simultaneously trained up to 1,500 people. These schools and courses for the year produced about 10,000 spies and saboteurs. It is clear that all this huge army of agents and saboteurs sooner or later put into action on the secret front of the war. However, to realize their insidious plans, Hitler's intelligence failed not only in the initial period of the war, but also in 1942, 1943 and subsequent years. Assessing the activities of the German fascist intelligence during the Great Patriotic War, one of its leaders stated it should be noted that we did not fulfill the task set before us. It depended not on the bad agent work of the Germans, but on the well-directed work of the Russians, on the good vigilance, not only of the servicemen, but also of the civilian population. The rear of the active Red Army was reliably guarded by border troops, military counterintelligence, state security agencies, and Soviet citizens, having found no support inside the USSR. Wrote the Pravda newspaper shortly after the war, faced with the united Soviet people and the high skill of Soviet intelligence agents, the fascist agents were powerless to carry out the plans of their masters. In the spring of 1942, the international and domestic situation of the Soviet Union improved significantly. The front of the anti-fascist struggle continued to expand and strengthen. A declaration of 26 countries was signed, which agreed to use all forces and means to fight against aggressive countries. The USA and England agreed to open the Second Front in Europe in 1942. Anti-fascist forces in many countries became significantly more active. On the Soviet-German front, there was a temporary lull. Both sides went on the defense, strengthened their positions. The Soviet people, encouraged by the first major victories of the Red Army, which marked the beginning of the turn in the war, did literally everything to produce more military equipment and weapons. The country was doing a tremendous job of putting into operation evacuated and building new industrial enterprises. The necessary conditions were being created for the transition of our troops in the counter-offensive. In May 1942, active military operations unfolded in the Kharkov area. On May 12, the troops of the Southwestern Front went on the offensive in the direction of Kharkov and made 2 strikes against the enemy from the area of Volchansk and from the Barvenkovsky protrusion. However, in the morning of May 17th, Hitlerites made a retaliatory blow. The enemy came to the flank of the left wing of the Southwestern Front. The situation of our troops sharply deteriorated. German troops took favorable initial positions for the offensive in the Stalingrad direction. The final report of the Southwestern Front Rear Guard headquarters of that time says, in view of the sharply changed situation at the front and on the section of the 21st Army, by order of the Military Council, the 92nd Frontier Regiment from the frontier Novosilovka, Nikanorovka, Maslovka, Voznesenskoye 26.6.42 withdrew to the frontier Chernyanka Kruglov. 3.7.42 withdrew to the line Istubnoye Alexievka, the regiment headquarters in the village Troitskoye. And further on the page of the report follows the following record 3.7.42 in view of the sudden approach of enemy tanks to the farm Matyushkin. First outpost independently withdrew behind the Don in the area of Arkhangelskoye. Then returned back to the Don in the area Davidovich, where organized a barrier service. The report recalled those difficult days, although the above document contains serious inaccuracies. The village of Arkhangelskoye, where we were taken by the headquarters report, was 70 kilometers from the Don on the eastern bank, and the farm Matyushkin about 15 kilometers west of the river. If we take into account that at that time from Voronezh to Korotoyak there were no bridge and ferry crossings, it was impossible to cross the river in 2 days near the village of Koristevan, to go 70 kilometers to Arkhangelskoye and return to Davidovka. And after all, this is what the document testified to. In fact, only the boundary, which was occupied by the outposts of our regiment, and the time of the events were correctly indicated in the report of the headquarters. We were located at that time in the village of Novosilovka at the junction of the 40th and 21st Armies. It was here that the Germans struck a strong blow, bypassed the defence of the 8th Division of the NKVD troops and developed an offensive in the direction of Tim-Syny-Lipyaji Voronezh. On July 1, 1942, liaison outpost Shishov and Pyatunin delivered an order from the battalion headquarters. The order summarized the situation, defined the strip and boundaries for service by the outpost, as well as measures to be taken in case of complication of the situation. The order specified the settlements through which it was necessary to pass in case of withdrawal. The order contained an instruction to move the outpost first to the village of Kladovo, and then to Koroshevka. This order we carried out. To the right and left of us there was fighting. And in Koroshevka, where the outpost came, it was quiet. We sent out troops, blocked all directions on the specified boundary. Meanwhile, the enemy began to develop the offensive to the south in the direction of bridges in the area Korotoyak-Lisky, where parts of the 21st Army and units of our regiment were retreating. Part of the troops found themselves between the advancing wedges of the enemy, the spearhead directed both to the northeast, to Voronezh, and to the southeast, to Korotoyak. In this space filled with enemy troops, found ourselves and we, the border guards of the first outpost. Sent to the left neighbour, Senior Lieutenant Syrenko. The liaisons of the outpost did not find him. The battalion headquarters could not be found either. In the village where it was located, the Germans were already ruling. On the same day, we were joined by a group of fighters headed by political officer Mobilizing from the 91st Border Regiment. He was glad to meet me and told me how he came to be here. While I was collecting the service outfits, the enemy occupied the village where the head of the outpost was with the rest of the border guards. 15 soldiers, with whom Paratroop Mobilizing came, were not superfluous in such a situation. I suggested, if everything turned out so, let's continue to act together. I agree, Mobilizing replied. I can't get through to my own anyway, and it's easier to act together. Having looked at the map, we came to the opinion that it was best to keep the course to the village of Istebnoy. It stood aside from the big roads, and according to our assumption, was not yet occupied by the enemy. The enemy was paving the way for his troops to Voronezh with powerful bombing strikes on a narrow 10-kilometer stretch. We felt it especially when we passed the village of Ostovichanko on the road to Istebnoy, when we moved away from it for several kilometers. In the rye crops we could see our bunkers. It was obviously a rear line of some Red Army unit, which was not occupied due to the current situation. From the ground the bunkers were almost invisible and seemed to us a safe shelter. But from the air they were perfectly visible. We had no time to appear here, as they say, as the enemy aviation struck. We rushed to the bunkers to hide in them from Hitler's planes. But it was as if the fascist pilots were waiting for it. They began to bomb the shelters with fierceness, making an approach on them. We had to break people into groups and get out from under the bombing. Finally, we were safe. It was getting dark. We approached the village, which seemed deserted. Not a single window was lit in the houses. On a spacious square, where several roads crossed, we were suddenly called. Stop! Who's coming? My own, I answered. A man of medium height with a rifle without bayonet appeared out of the darkness. What village? What village? Istebno, answered the man. Any military? No. The militia of our district and all the district authorities are in that house over there, the man showed his hand. And who will you be? Border guards. That's good, said the man and led us to the house. Having positioned the fighters nearby, I entered the building with Goncharov, Mobilizing, and Jamoldanov. In the corridor, the reddish light of a kerosene lamp shone dimly through the pall of tobacco smoke. Many people were sitting in chairs, on tables, on the floor, and talking. The man at the door asked again, "Who are they?" and recognizing that the border guards had arrived, he hid in one of the rooms. In a minute he invited us in. In the room a smoky lamp hung from the ceiling, and at a large square table, leaning against it, sat an elderly man with a tanned, manly face. To his right was a police captain, and on the other side were several men in civilian clothes. I introduced myself. Head of the border outpost. The man with the tanned face extended his hand. Secretary of the district committee. He offered to sit down and immediately asked where we were coming from and what we knew about the situation. As I realized, we were in the Istebninsky district, which bordered the Sine-Lepyogovsky district. In addition to the workers of the district committee and the district executive committee, there were the heads of the Sine-Lepyogovsky MTS together with the head of the political department. We explained that we do not know the exact situation at the front, as we had no communication with our headquarters for the third day already. But apparently the situation is not good. Our units are retreating. We began to discuss the situation. We decided to send a reconnaissance to the villages around Istebnoy, with which there was no telephone communication. The secretary of the district committee called the names of those present 6 people, divided them into pairs, and said, "Take your horses, go to your villages, establish what is there, and come back here quickly." A policeman and one of the MTS workers went to Sini-Lipiagi. Sini-Lipiagi interested us most of all. From here there were good dirt roads to Voronezh and Korotoyak. When all questions were solved, we went outside. The night was dark and warm. There were still no lights in the houses. With one of the local comrades we put out sentries at the entrance to the village. The rest of the border guards were allowed to rest. While waiting for the return of the reconnaissance with political officer Mobilizing, Lieutenants Goncharov and Dzemoldenov sat down not far from the house where the district leadership was located. The ground was as warm as the air. It smelled of wormwood, and it was as if everything around them had died out, not a sound. Only a sentry would make a step or two, and then silence again. Comrade Chief suddenly heard someone's voice from the darkness. Who's there? I, Comrade Chief, Petty Officer Gorodniansky. It was the new petty officer of the outpost, already the second after Vershinin. What happened? Nothing's wrong. Just thought I'd clarify where we'll have breakfast here or somewhere in the camp. What do you think? Here is better, Comrade Chief. It's easier for the cook to cook. The well is nearby, there's wood, and the kitchen can be camouflaged. All right, cook here, I agreed. Keep in mind that there will be no time to eat lunch, so make a big breakfast. By dawn, so that the men are fed and your household is ready to march. Understood, permission to go. Go, but see that the cook is careful with the fire, not to demask us. The petty officer left. Somewhere in the direction of Voronezh, light threads stretched in the dark sky. They became wider and narrower, they converged at an angle, then diverged, then fell, then rose, illuminating the dark horizon. Then they disappeared. They rose again, crossed, and fell to the ground again. Searchlights are looking for something. Political officer Goncharov raised his voice. I don't hear any German planes, said Dzemoldenov. Apparently their own didn't return from the mission. They were silent. Then Goncharov spoke again. I haven't heard anything about the second front, friends. It seems to have promised the Allies, but do not open. Do you think they will not open the second front this year? Asked Paratroop Maltsev. Until we finally drive the fascists to the west, they won't open it, Dzemoldenov said with conviction. Perhaps you are right, Garif Sadikovich, agreed Goncharov. We'll have to beat the fascist beast alone. Then somehow, unnoticeably, they talked about personal matters. Goncharov, are you married? Asked political officer Maltsev. No, I have not had time, said Ivan Ivanovich. Mother stayed at home and father. It turned out that everyone was single Dzemoldenov, myself and Maltsev, but everyone had someone at home. And we remembered our home, our relatives and friends with a slight sadness, not knowing when we would see them, and whether we would see them at all. Letters came to the front not often. During all this time I received only one from my older sister, Polina, and I sent the only one myself somewhere right after the battle at Korostov. At that time about this battle was written in the detachment newspaper. I sent the paper as well. Polina reported that our youngest, Anna, had gone to the front. The middle one, Maria, was preparing to work behind enemy lines. Polina herself, having seen her husband off to war, was staying in Moscow. They began to dream. Here the war will end, said Goncharov thoughtfully. I will return home, armed with miner's armour, and will again cut coal. And who will let you go from the army? I joined the conversation. You're a political officer. First, in peacetime the number of the army will be much smaller, said Goncharov, and therefore there will be less need for commanders and political workers. And secondly, I am not a cadre military. If it were not for Hitler, maybe I would not have been called up for active service. I would be giving myself a coal on the mountain. Well, don't take your word for it, Ivan Ivanovich. When the war is over, you'll enter the academy and become a prominent military commander or a political officer on a large scale. No, stretched Goncharov. I'm a mine foreman, you know, I'm a miner. My place there in the coal mine. We continued to dream about where one of us would live, work and study after the war. Looking ahead, I will say that Ivan Goncharov's dream did not come true. He did not return to the mine. He was seriously wounded and hospitalized. After recovery, he served until 1949 as a duty military commandant at one of the stations of the Moscow Railroad junction. During the leisurely conversation, we did not notice how two men came to the house. Tying the horses to the hedge, they went inside. I, Goncharov, Dzemoldenov and Maltsev followed them. They were the scouts whom the secretary of the district party committee had sent to Signy-le-Piage. Everyone in the house was asleep. People were lying straight on the floor or sitting at tables with their heads on their hands. The secretary of the district committee, the captain of the militia, and the others were dozing. The people who entered called the secretary by his first name and patronymic. He raised his head. "Well?" "There are Germans in Signy-le-Piage. The streets are full of tanks, guns, automobiles." "Well, sit down, comrades. We'll wait for the others." A little while later, everyone the secretary of the district committee sent arrived. People reported that there were no troops in the nearest villages. "Yes, bad news," as if to himself the secretary remarked and thought. "There was something for us to think about. Where is the battalion or regiment headquarters now? Where to go? Our map ended at Istobny. We could not estimate the further route of movement or at least imagine where the regimental or battalion headquarters could be at that time. As it became known later, there were no more units of our regiment on the western side of the Don by this time. July 18th, 1942, on the order of the regiment, went to the eastern bank of the Don and carried out barrier service on the boundary Korostevin-Korotoyak, stated in the report of the headquarters of the 92nd Border Regiment of those days. The morning light came through the curtains into the room where we were passing the time. Someone had extinguished the lamp and pulled back the curtains. The outline of the village came into view. The rays of the sun slid across the tiled and thatched roofs of the houses. A cow rumbled. Petty Officer Gorodniansky invited us to breakfast. At the barn stood our wagon, and 70 meters from it under the spreading crown of poplars at the camp kitchen gathered fighters. A little farther away at the well, Sergeants Pugashev and Vekshin were washing up. "After a sleepless night, it's not a bad idea for us to freshen up," Dzamoldinov suggested. The cold water relieved drowsiness. Then the petty officer fed us with millet porridge. We had just eaten breakfast when we heard the rumble of an engine. Someone shouted, "Rama is flying." A German reconnaissance plane shot a machine gun at the village, made a circle and departed to Korotoyak. I gave a command to the petty officer to prepare the men for the march, to remove the sentries from the outskirts of the village. For a year of war we had well studied the enemy tactics. Tanks appeared after the reconnaissance airplane. "Well, what are we going to do, Senior Lieutenant?" asked the secretary of the district committee. "I think we should wait for tanks soon," I replied. "How soon?" The secretary of the district committee asked me again. "Well, I won't say in minutes, but soon." And indeed, not even a quarter of an hour later, as behind the village heard an artillery cannonade, and then finally shook off the morning silence rumble of tank engines. It was getting closer. Machine gun bursts became clearly audible. Our troops west of Istobnoy were not. Apparently the Hitlerites organized shooting when they saw the bunkers and trenches, in which there was not a single person. It happened. Fascists often bombed or shelled empty roads, groves, hollows, heights, as they say, just in case. "Let's withdraw," said the secretary of the district committee. In the daylight his face seemed pale yellow, tired. "We can't get to Voronezh," I said. "It would be better, perhaps, to Korotoyak. There, they say, there is a bridge across the Don. Perhaps it is more convenient to go to the Don, through the village of Storozhevoye," advised the secretary of the district committee. "It's in our district. There is a fishing collective farm there. We can cross the river by boat." At first we walked along the field road. On the right and on the left stretched ripening wheat fields. It hid us well from the enemy's gaze. Then we moved along a deep gully until we reached a small hill with a forest plantation. The sun had risen to its zenith and was scorching mercilessly. At least a small breeze. Everything in nature froze, died out. At a height in a sparse forest we made a short break. It was clearly visible how through Istobnoy, raising dust clouds, a continuous stream of German motorcycles, armoured cars, tanks, cars with infantry. All this spread out on the roads to Voronezh and Korotoyak. Leaving the forest plantations, we walked uphill for an hour or an hour and a half and found ourselves in a rather deep ravine overgrown with reeds and bushes. The ravine led us to a small village with houses clinging to the bank of a shallow rivulet. It was the farm Rosushki. Our companions went home, and we had to replenish our food supplies. The July night is short. I had no time to sleep as it was already dawning. The guard on duty quietly gave the command, "Get up." The squad commanders got up quickly, built their subordinates without fuss. A petty officer rode forward on a cart. Our companions also gathered together skillfully. For 4 hours we walked along the flat field. Then a dark forest loomed ahead. Someone said, "Matyushkin Farm." We could hardly see any houses. Dense orchards covered them. Not far from Matyushkin there was a ravine stretching for 20 kilometers, if not more. It was a powerful natural anti-tank barrier. Further on we could see a dense grove. That's where we moved. With great difficulty we managed to lower the wagon down the steep slope of the ravine. It was even more difficult to get out. We had to take everything off the wagon and lift it up on our own. The wagon itself was also pulled up. We walked along the edge of the grove for about an hour more, until at last we found ourselves on the outskirts of the village of Storozhevoye, perched on the steep bank of the Don. As we approached the village, we saw the following picture. Women, old men, children were sitting, walking, standing in gardens near houses, in the streets, right on the bank. There were also Red Army soldiers, mostly wounded. Nearby cows, horses, sheep were grazing. All this settled near the Don with the intention of crossing to the other bank. There were a dozen boats at the disposal of those who crossed. Several hundred people, civilian and military, crowded around them. Interfering with each other, they tried to get into the boats. However, no one was able to cross the river. Overcrowded boats overturned before leaving the shore. Noise, screams and crying of children were heard. Enemy airplanes appeared. They flew over the crossing on a swooping flight and machine-gunned the gathered. This increased the panic. The planes appeared again. People fled, looking for escape from the bullets. Seeing this, the secretary of the district committee, the chief of police and I decided to turn our group into a chain, push the crowd away from the shore, and establish a strict order of crossing. We decided to send women and children across the Don first, then the wounded, then the rest. The last to cross would be the fighters and commanders. To realize our intention, however, was not so easy. But gradually the passions subsided. Everyone began to wait patiently for their turn. Being unexpectedly commandant of the crossing, I ordered to gather to the pier all the boats, which could accommodate at once no more than 60 people, and, having divided the local fishermen into crews of rowers, appointed the junior political officer Goncharov in charge of them. On each boat he put another fighter to help him. Through the corridor formed by border guards, Sergeants Pugachev and Vek Shin led the first group of women and children. The flights to the eastern shore of the Don began. Group after group we sent old men, women, children and wounded soldiers. Then the rest in the order of priority, so about 700 people were transported. When people were on the other bank and there was a relative calm, we, together with cattle drivers from evacuated state and collective farms, with great difficulty drove several hundred horses and cows into the water, and they swam to the eastern bank. Difficulties arose with the crossing of sheep. The sheep did not want to get into the boats. The first sheep voyage was not quite successful. Some of the animals jumped out of the boats in the middle of the river and sank. However, when a considerable number of sheep accumulated on the other bank, they willingly came to the boats, and the crossing went faster. In this way 400 or 500 sheep were transported. During the night in the village again, accumulated a lot of citizens, fighters and commanders. And at dawn in the area of Matyushkin Farm, there was a rifle and machine gun fire, which was gradually joined by artillery. Several shells exploded in the village and in the Don. A contact from Dishamoldanov, who had stayed in Matyushkin with a group of fighters for cover, came running. German tanks with a troop of machine gunners burst into the farm, the fighter reported. After a firefight, we moved behind the ravine and entrenched. Border guard Bondar was lightly wounded, and the lieutenant was wounded by 3 bullets through his uniform, but only burned his back. He asked to know how to proceed. Tell Jamaldinov to keep watching the farm. If the situation changes, report to me immediately. At the signal of white and red rockets, come here to the crossing. While this conversation was going on, a dozen or two horsemen came to the crossing. Many of them sat on their horses without saddles. Each of them had a trench coat on his shoulders and a machine gun on his chest. The horsemen immediately headed for the crossing. Sergeants Pugashev and Vekshin, with the help of other border guards, tried to stop the horsemen, but they stubbornly pressed on them. Then, with Petty Officer Gorodniansky and other border guards of the outpost, I rushed to help. The matter almost came to a skirmish. Fortunately, at that time a car appeared on the road. Two men in dark blue chauffeurs' overalls and generals' caps got out of it. We were at the bottom, at the crossing, and the men, overalls on top of their clothes, were standing at the top of the cliff. This arrangement made them look tall and broad-shouldered. One of the arrivals commanded in a commanding voice, "Bring the commandant of the crossing to me." This cooled the ardor of the cavalry. They quickly left the crossing and from the village of Storozhvoy hastily moved northward along the shore. I reported what had happened. The passenger car with the generals moved south to Korotoyak. For 2 more days we transported in boats wounded and refugees to the eastern shore. German machine gunners twice tried to break into Matushkin Farm, but the border guards under the command of Lieutenant Jamoldinov met them with friendly fire. The Germans fled under the protection of their tanks. In one of the pauses, I told Jamoldinov to leave the occupied frontier and join us. The outpost crossed the Don. We found ourselves in the village of Anashkin, where soon arrived a reinforced rifle battalion of one of the units of the 6th Army. Because of unfamiliarity with the situation, the battalion commander allowed people to go home and left the artillery battery, mortars, machine guns right on the street. The equipment stood in the order that the units followed on the march. With junior political officer Goncharov, I searched for the battalion commander and introduced myself. Head of the outpost of the 92nd Border Regiment. "Is there a border on the Don now?" ironically said the commander. "Everything moves, and the border also moves," I said calmly, "but carelessness it is unjustified in any place. Your people think that the war is no more. They abandoned their equipment, went to their houses, hoping that the river is ahead. But it's not so wide. Don't let the German machine gunners pinch you." "Are you kidding?" asked the commander. "What machine gunners?" "At dawn we crossed here from Storozhvoy," I explained. "Our troops are not on that side. There are Germans in Matushkin Farm. Whether our troops are to the right or left of Storozhvoy, I don't know." The battalion commander correctly perceived our information and immediately ordered the unit commanders to begin to equip the defensive area. We returned to the border guards of the outpost. In the evening the commander found us. "Senior Lieutenant, help me. Organize the guard along the river bank, then I will not remove people from the defensive work." "Okay, I can do that. Let's set a password to identify our own." Then we identified the areas where we needed to set up the defense detail. At night, Jamoldinov and I again went to the house where the battalion headquarters was located. The commander had decided to send a reconnaissance team to the other side of the river and was just briefing the scouts. Seeing us, he asked, "Senior Lieutenant, your men have just arrived from there. They probably know the terrain on the other side well. Allocate an escort." I looked at Garif Jamoldinov. He understood my look. "Well, it can be done." Together with the scouts we went to the shore. 6 Red Army soldiers, a lieutenant from the battalion and Jamoldinov got into a boat and set sail. In about 30 minutes the western shore was illuminated by the light of tracer bullets and rockets. Machine gun bursts were heard. The reconnaissance had stumbled upon the Germans. The boat with Jamoldinov and the men returned. At dawn the outpost moved from Anashkin to rest in a deep winding ravine covered with dense bushes. The precaution was not superfluous. In the morning a dozen or two enemy planes appeared. Having turned over the river, they began to dive on the village. Bombs were falling with howling and squealing. The wreckage of pillboxes flew up. Pillars of sand and water, raised by explosions, rose above the bank and the river. The walls of our ravine were shaking as if in a fever. Then the bombing moved to Davidovka station. There the elevator and fuel tanks caught fire. Having waited until the last airplanes left, Goncharov and I went to the battalion commander's CP, hoping to establish communication with our command through his headquarters. However, the commander himself had no communication with anyone. He once again thanked us for the warning, noticed that the losses from the bombing were not great. Back in the ravine, we gathered for a military council. Giamoldanov, political officers Goncharov, Maltsev, and I discussed the situation. For more than 20 days we had no communication with the battalion headquarters and regimental headquarters. The place of their stay is also unknown. We were running out of food it was inconvenient to take from the population. We decided to move to the district centre Davidovka, which was 5 kilometers away. Perhaps there we could establish contact with our command through local authorities or find out where it was. When we entered Davidovka, we saw at the railroad station black, ruptured and still smoking tanks. In the broken elevator something was burning. Wheat piles were smouldering everywhere. It was as if the city had died out. We followed the deserted streets through the centre to the outskirts and up the hill. Just to the right of the road was a large garden and a few brick buildings. The most striking was a long 2-story white building with a blank wall overlooking the garden. Here the outpost was stationed under the sprawling pear trees. Having entrusted Giamoldanov with organising the guard service and blocking the road to Davidovka, Goncharov, Maltsev and I went in search of the district leaders. We wandered for a long time through unfamiliar streets until we came upon the building of the district NKVD department. The duty officer took us to the chief. Having checked our documents, the chief said, "Unfortunately, I can't help you contact your headquarters. There is no communication with anyone. You see what is going on in the city. But we'll give you some food." During this and the next day we, having organised a checkpoint, gathered in Davidovka about 200 soldiers and commanders who had fallen behind their units. Then several cars came to our checkpoint. In one of them was the deputy commander of the 6th Army, whose troops were reaching the Don. We told the general who we were and what we were doing. "And what kind of army is this?" Coming up to the line of commanders and Red Army soldiers who had fallen behind their units, the general asked. "Yes, it has gathered for 2 days, Comrade General," Petty Officer Gorodniansky reported cheerfully. The general walked along the line. He asked some servicemen what regiments they were from and why they were here. Then, coming up to the lieutenant, he ordered, "You, Lieutenant, are in charge. Take everyone to the assembly point of the reserve regiment." The general named the number of the regiment and the village where the regiment was located. The lieutenant loudly commanded to the right, march, and the formation moved along the road. The general, the commanders who had arrived with him, and the guards settled in the brick houses and in the garden next door to us. Soon I, Giamoldanov, Goncharov and Maltsev were invited by the adjutant of the general. We reported to the deputy commander of the army about our arrival. He unfolded the map and said, "Write down the villages," and named 5 settlements. Then turned to Giamoldanov, Goncharov and Maltsev. "At your disposal are allocated 4 trucks. You will each go to the specified villages. Collect there all the retired fighters and commanders and transfer them to the assembly point. If you meet units with commanders, send them here directly to me." For several days we collected small units, formed companies and sent them to the defence, and carried out other assignments of the deputy commander of the 6th Army. This continued until the 25th Rifle Division came up and took up the defence along the bank of the Don. The division was in this area in defence until winter. It occupied a bridgehead in the village of Storozhevoy, from which on January 13th, 1943 began the offensive of our troops on Kharkov. One day the general invited us. "Thank you, border guards, for your help. Now you can go to your unit. From the front headquarters I was informed that your regiment was concentrated in Budarin." This message pleased us. At the same time I thought, who will believe that we did exactly what we did, gaining courage? I asked the general to give the necessary certificate. He opened the field bag and wrote in his notebook in a sprawling handwriting the unit of the 92nd Frontier Regiment after the fulfillment of a special task is going to its unit. We were going southeast on dusty steppe roads under the scorching rays of the sun. and tanks, cars, artillery, infantry and cavalry were moving towards us. About halfway to Budarin, we made a halt in a small village. The collective farmers welcomed us cordially. While we were washing our boots and uniforms soaked with sweat and dust in the river, the chairman of the collective farm organized lunch. The women fed us with excellent borscht and fried potatoes with pork, saying, "Eat, my dears, gain strength. Beat them, the enemy." Among kind, caring people, we felt as if we were at home. Our mood lifted, our strength increased. At night we made the last crossing and in the morning came to Budarin. The village lay in a deep round hollow. In the centre the houses were densely arranged, and on the edges stood separate huts. At the entrance on a hillside, a little away from the road, stood a large clean barn, next to which grew huge apple trees. Here the outpost was located. The battalion headquarters was not far away. I met several chiefs of outposts, among them Senior Lieutenant Syrenko. My appearance, as it seemed to me, caused perplexity. Syrenko said with a sly smile, "Listen, and you here with the whole outpost have already been written off by order as missing in action." "I guess you helped in that," I sneered. "From the village of Koroshevka I sent contact men to you, and your trail was gone." Go, Syrenko said good-naturedly, "but don't whine when they're taking off your shavings." I reported to the battalion commander about my arrival. "Good," he said. "Where did you place the outpost?" "There, on the hillock by the barn," I showed him. "Leave the liaisons and put the men in order," he said dryly. At 17 o'clock the liaisons came and told us that the communists were to come to the meeting. While we were packing and walking, the meeting had already begun. My question was discussed. The report was made by the Deputy Battalion Commander for Political Discipline. I was accused that I deliberately did not seek communication with the battalion command. A number of other unfounded accusations were made. It was hurtful and painful. Nobody asked me about anything, where I was, what I was doing. By some misunderstanding I was attributed to undeserved things. The report was over. I stood up and said, "It's all untrue." In the evening I was called to the regimental headquarters. Grabbing the political officer of the outpost of the 91st Regiment Maltsev, I went to the report with a heavy thought. The regiment commander Blumin listened to me attentively, and when I finished, noticed. So, not only came myself, but also brought others. Then he explained to political officer Maltsev where the 91st Regiment was, and he said to me, "Go to the regimental Commissar Klayev." In the next room at the table sat Regimental Commissar Klayev, whom I knew before the war in the Kiev border district, and our battalion Commissar Tarakanov. Regimental Commissar Klayev offered to sit down and asked, "Tell me about everything in order." I had to list where and what the outpost was doing, and in conclusion I had to present a certificate from the Deputy Commander of the 6th Army. "All right," said Klayev. "Go to your men, work, we will not allow you to offend." The border guards of the outpost were sleeping peacefully. Politruk Goncharov and Petty Officer Gorodniansky were awake. "Well, what's going on at regimental headquarters?" "I'm tired, Ivan, I'm hungry. Tomorrow you'll find out everything. Regimental Commissar Klayev is here." We had dinner and laid down under an apple tree. Goncharov and the petty officer quickly fell asleep. And I still long went over in my memory everything that had happened to us during these days, thought about the unpleasant conversation that had taken place at the party meeting, remembered the calm and friendly words of Regimental Commissar Klayev. In the morning they announced the regiment's formation. The regiment lined up on the outskirts of Budarin in the garden. In front of the line stood a representative of the front rear guard department, Regimental Commissar Klayev. Regimental Commander Major Blumin gave the command attention. "Listen to the order." Regimental Commissar Klayev read out the order signed by Stalin. This order introduced strict measures to combat panickers and violators of discipline, strongly condemned retreating sentiments. The order stated that the iron law for the active troops should be the requirement not to step back. Then I and political officer Goncharov were called to the middle of the formation. The regimental commissar thanked us for our skillful actions on the Don, precisely because we acted as Stalin's order required. My heart was relieved. My worries were in vain. Then I was called back to headquarters. The regimental commissar handed me a party card, which was issued back in March 1942, after my candidacy expired. The troops of the 21st Army were withdrawing to the south. Our regiment was transferred to its left flank. We started a very hard march under the scorching sun and continuous bombing to the station Tingtuta 60 kilometers southwest of Stalingrad. However, we did not have to defend the city. The southwestern front was disbanded. On the basis of its management, they created the Stalingrad front, and we were assigned to the Voronezh front. And our regiment went back to the north along the steppes, smelling of wormwood, along the farms, stanitsas and villages drowned in greenery. Our 1,260-kilometre campaign, as it is recorded in the report of the regiment headquarters, ended at the station Talovaya near Voronezh in early September 1942. We went out to protect the rear of the 6th Army on the line Bobrov-Vutalinovka. Our first outpost settled in the village of Alyacha. The situation on the Voronezh front was characterized by stability, and we stayed in the village all fall. The border guards had studied the terrain well, knew every ravine, every forest. We established a close connection with the leadership of collective farms and settlement Soviets. Paratroop Goncharov often spoke to collective farmers, told about the situation at the front, about the intrigues of enemy agents, urged people to be vigilant. But in the interfluve of the Volga and the Don, in the Stalingrad direction, one of the most decisive battles of the past war was unfolding. Hitler's strategic plan was to seize the largest industrial region and an important strategic point, which was Stalingrad. As once at Moscow, now, according to the plan of Hitler's command, the outcome of the war was to be decided at Stalingrad. To accomplish this task was thrown one of the most capable armies of Germany under the command of General F. Paulus. This army had travelled a long way across Europe. Now it was rushing to the Volga. It was attached to help 5 infantry, 3 tank and 2 motorized divisions from Army Group Center, transferred from Voronezh direction. Here also came from the Caucasus 4th Tank Army, from the reserve the 8th Italian. The 3rd Romanian Army was moving towards Stalingrad. In September, Hitlerites rushed to storm the Volga stronghold. Residents of neighboring villages and border guards often asked political officer Goncharov or me, "How is it at Stalingrad?" I had to explain to the soldiers and villagers the messages of the Sovinform reports, tell them how our troops were fighting at Stalingrad. Often these were impromptu speeches, without preparation, on the spot. We saw women working in the field. We approached them and started a conversation. They would ask, we would answer. This was how a conversation emerged, during which various questions that people were interested in were clarified. Sometimes there were a lot of them about the latest resolutions of the party and the government, about help from the Allies, about when we would finally kick the fascists out of our land, and whether we would cross our border and fight in Germany. They often asked about the fate of their husbands, brothers, fathers who had gone to the front and from whom they had not heard for a long time. We tried to answer these questions. Sometimes we took newspapers and read interesting articles to people. The newspapers came to the villages less often than to us, and when the situation became more complicated, postal communication with district centres and other settlements stopped altogether. Again, we combed the fields and ravines, blocked the roads, checked the people passing and passing through them. A strict control was established in the rear of our troops. And again, as on the banks of the Seversky Donets and Oskol, enemy spies and saboteurs fell into our hands. I remember, as in the beginning of September 1942, I sent for service border guards Pyatunin and Mashkin in the direction of the farm Volnoy. At that time, our airplanes were returning to their airfields after assaulting enemy positions. Suddenly, one of them had a motor failure. The airplane began to descend. Seeing this, Pyatunin and Mashkin rushed to it. When landing on a potato field, the airplane flipped over. The machine lay flat with the wheels spinning by inertia. "Hey, is there anyone there in the airplane?" asked Mashkin, who ran up. Yes, heard a muffled voice, "Help to get out." "And how to do it?" Pyatunin asked. What tools do you have? Small demolition shovels. Try digging up the ground under the hood, replied the voice. Pyatunin and Mashkin set to work. The earth, fortunately, turned out to be pliable, soft. Border guards quickly dug holes on both sides and released the pilot from his forced confinement. He was the deputy commander of the aviation regiment. Well, thank you, brothers, for helping to get out of this trap. Mashkin and Pyatunin took the pilot to the location of the outpost. He asked to take the plane under guard until the arrival of vehicles for towing. We complied with the pilot's request, and for good reason. The next day in the evening, Ifrieta Mashkin and Private Zakhaladejny, following the change of sentry guarding the airplane, suddenly noticed a lurking man in the sunflowers. "Stop," shouted Mashkin. The unknown man threw a grenade at the soldiers and ran away. Fortunately, the grenade exploded aside and Mashkin was only slightly scratched by small splinters. Having recovered from the surprise, the border guards rushed after the one who tried to get away from them. Here the sunflower crops ended. Having jumped out of them, the soldiers saw an unknown man. A machine gun burst. The man lay down on a height and took the border guards under fire. A fight ensued. Suddenly the unknown man jumped up and hid behind the slope of the height. Mashkin was the first to run up the hill. The man was leaving. Seeing that he could not be taken alive, the border guard stood and put his rifle to his shoulder and fired. The fleeing man swung his arms clumsily and collapsed to the ground. The border guards ran up to him. The only thing he managed to say was that there were 3 of them, and that they had been dropped on parachutes. The outpost began a search. We called the inhabitants of the nearest villages for help, warning them that the parachutists, in all probability, were dressed in Red Army uniforms and had automatic rifles. During the night and the whole next day, the border guards of the outpost literally probed the whole neighborhood, but without success. Troops blocked all directions. Together with the scout Lieutenant Vasilchenko, who came to help us, we traveled around one village after another, talking to the inhabitants. Finally, in the village of Ikarets, we managed to get data a few kilometers east of the Don. Somewhere between the villages of Anashkino and Korostevan, there is a field camp. A woman lives there with a boy of 5 or 6 years old. 3 days ago at night, 2 men dressed in Red Army uniforms came to her house, and, saying that they were returning from the hospital, asked to spend the night. They began to look for the woman and her child. And in one village we met an old man who complained to us that a week ago his daughter-in-law quarrelled with him and left home with her grandson. The signs coincided. We were helped to establish the exact location of the field camp. A guide taken from the collective farm led us to the right place. Indeed, in the house at the field camp there was a woman of about 25 years old and a 5-year-old boy with her. The woman confirmed everything. 2 suspicious people dressed in Red Army uniforms came in, spent the night and left, promising to drop by again, as their friend would soon be discharged from the hospital and they were going to meet him. For 3 days and 3 nights the soldiers, led by Sergeant Moisenko, did not sleep, being in ambush at the field camp. But the guests were not announced. On the 4th day early in the morning I arrived here with Lieutenant Vasilchenko and a group of soldiers. Smoke was coming from the chimney of the house. The landlady was stoking the furnace. Moisenko reported that nothing suspicious had been noticed during the service. We decided to dismantle the ambush. Vasilchenko and I sat down on the porch. The sun came up. A boy in a red shirt with dishevelled hair ran out into the street, gawking at us in his sleep. "That's where my little boy runs," Vasilchenko said with a slight sadness. "As soon as I sent my wife and children away on June 22nd, I never heard from them again." He beckoned the boy to him and sat him on his lap. I noticed how his hands trembled and his eyes moistened at the former soldier. And the boy suddenly asked, "Uncle, why aren't those 2 men coming to our house?" "What 2? Wasichenko was surprised. "And those that came to us, and even Mom was not told to say where they go." "And where are they, son?" stroked the boy Vasilchenko. "Over there," the boy showed his hand in the field. "Let's go, uncle, I'll show you." We took the fighters, and the boy led us through the sunflower fields. Sergeant Moisenko was in the lead. In the middle of the field, the sergeant raised his hand. It meant they are here. Two soldiers silently approached Moisenko. The guests were sleeping serenely, covered with a cloak tent. Moisenko carefully took their automatic rifles and commanded, "Get up." The lying men instantly reached out with their hands to where their weapons had just been. But when they saw the muzzles of rifles pointed at them and heard the command, "Lie down," they raised their hands up. The border guards searched the people who were looking at us with an angry look and took from them a bag of cartridges for PPS rifle, Red Army books, and an extract from the field hospital, which said that after recovery such people were going to their unit. The equipment of them and the one who appeared at the airplane was the same. The woman identified the aliens, which was recorded in the protocol. At the preliminary investigation, the detainees confessed that they were Hitler's agents, trained in a special school. They had to establish the location of the Red Army headquarters and the presence of military equipment in the area of the station Kornovaya, and after completing the task to cross back across the Don. They should be waiting for them there. At first everything went quite smoothly. However, when returning, being near the station Kornovaya, they lost their senior in the forest. So they waited for him at the agreed place. But he did not come. So the 5-year-old boy, without knowing it, helped us to find those who were thrown by Hitlerites in our front rear to fulfill a special task of fascist intelligence. Where is this boy from an unknown village in the Voronezh region now? Does he remember how he helped the border guards? Soon transport vehicles arrived to the plane. Aviation specialists separated the wings, lifted the tail of the attack aircraft into the body, and took the plane to the airfield. Between the border guards in connection with this, there was such a conversation. Well, now we have airplanes no worse than the German ones. Wait. There will be something else. Especially everyone was surprised by the hangars on which the rockets were attached. This gave a special weight to the new airplane in the eyes of the soldiers. Wow, they said, Katyusha on the attack aircraft already adapted. In the middle of November came good news from near Stalingrad. After heavy, exhausting summer and fall battles in this direction, as well as in the foothills of the Caucasus, the pressure of the advancing fascist troops weakened. Already in early November, 1942, began a systematic movement of troops of our Voronezh front from north to south along the Don. The Soviet troops were preparing a powerful counterattack in the Stalingrad area. Following, the 6th Army units of the 92nd Border Regiment were also moving. In the second half of November, we found ourselves in the working settlement of Kislyai. Here the radio brought us the glad tidings our troops on November 19th went on a decisive counter-offensive, broke through the enemy defences, surrounded the 6th German Army near Stalingrad, and successfully moved westward. We knew, as well as near Moscow, as part of the active Red Army troops in the defence of Stalingrad participated in the border regiments. They served to protect the rear of the front, defended communications, engaged in fierce battles with the enemy, inflicting him significant losses. In the orders that came to us said, for example, about the 79th Frontier Regiment guarding the rear of the 62nd Army of General V. I. Chukov. The regiment ensured normal operation of the Volga crossing near the tractor factory, which played the same role for the city as the famous ice road of life for Leningrad. The crossing was continuously shelled by artillery and mortar fire, bombed from the air. In these conditions, border guards kept their combat watch day and night. Thus, in the battle with the many times superior enemy forces, the 3rd Battalion of the 79th Border Guard Regiment, under the command of the military commander of the battalion, Dukin, defended the crossing of the Volga River, giving the opportunity to transfer to Stalingrad the 13th Guards Division of General A. I. Rodimtsev. In September 1942, some units of Hitlerites broke through to the centre of the city. The 79th Regiment, until the approach of reinforcements for 2 days, held back the onslaught of the numerically superior enemy, did not allow him to go to the bank of the Volga. As a result of operational and service activity of the 79th Border Regiment, 280 agents of enemy intelligence were also neutralized. Border guards of the 2nd and 98th Regiments caught, and in case of resistance destroyed loners and small groups of the enemy. a group of soldiers of the 98th Border Regiment in the area of Stary Rogachik were detained 2 German officers who broke through the encirclement. One of them, deputy commander of the 9th Anti-Aircraft Division Richard Chatzman, was appointed by Hitler's command as commandant of Stalingrad, which had not yet been taken. In the battles near Stalingrad distinguished the 10th Division of the NKVD troops, under the command of Major General A.A. Sarayev and military commander Colonel P.N. Kuznetsov. The division included many border guards. Until October 1942, that is, until the approach of the main forces of the 62nd Army, the division held off the onslaught of the enemy on a wide front. Neither fierce bombing, nor hurricane shelling and massive attacks of tanks and infantry could not break the resilience of the soldiers' Chekists. "There is no land beyond the Volga for us," proclaimed the defenders of the city, and stood to the death. The division fought the fiercest battles in the area of the tractor factory, on the approaches to Mamayev-Kurgan, and in the centre of the city. Here, in the battles for Stalingrad, the 10th Division of the NKVD troops inflicted heavy losses on the enemy: 113 tanks, 189 mortars and machine guns, over 15,000 enemy soldiers and officers were destroyed. For courage and bravery shown during the defence of the Volga stronghold, the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR awarded the division with the Order of Lenin, and after the completion of the battle on the Volga River, the division received the honorary name of Stalingrad. Many of its officers and soldiers were awarded orders and medals. Near Stalingrad fought the Volga military flotilla, which included the 11th Brigade of frontier ships under the command of Rear Admiral S.M. Voroboyov. Armoured gunboats of officers, border guards, senior lieutenants Pospelov, Karpukin, Shabakov, Lieutenant Borbotko made powerful fire strikes on the advancing enemy, made daring raids in the rear of the German troops that came to the Volga, landed paratroopers, provided crossing the Volga troops, but military equipment, ammunition and food supply, evacuation of the wounded. On the Stalingrad direction fought, and the 21st Army, the rear of which we guarded on the Seversky Donets and Oskol. Somewhere was with his troops and Regimental Commissar Bogotikov. The 21st Army participated directly in the liquidation of the encircled group of Hitler's troops in the counteroffensive. It was soldiers of this army together with 62nd Army of General Chuikov knocked out Hitlerites from Stalingrad itself. After the war one got in my hands the memoirs of Colonel Wilhelm Adam of the German Army, one of those who found themselves in the Stalingrad cauldron. How much stronger we became by the end of 1942, beginning of 1943. Not without pleasure I read a confession about how our troops smashed the encircled group of the enemy. Everything was rattling around. The earth was shaking. Steel hail fell on the fortress of Stalingrad, crushed people and animals, shattered shelters, cars, weapons and torn telephone wires. Wrote V. Adam. Communication between the Army Command and headquarters was still maintained by several radio transmitters that survived the bursts of shells, mines and volleys of rocket mortars. That was the response of the Red Army. This is how things were now. Not there, but our tank wedges were cracking the defence. Not Hitler's, but avalanches of Soviet tanks were on the offensive. Times have changed. The strategic initiative passed to the Red Army. The course and outcome of the war was predetermined. On January 13th, 1943, the troops of our Voronezh front went on the offensive, with the task of defeating the German, Italian and Hungarian troops on the Upper Don, in the areas of Ostrogozhsk, Rossosha and Voronezh. It was the so-called Ostrogozhsko-Rossoshanskaya operation. Advancement of our troops was successful, despite the difficult weather conditions. The snow covered the roads, but people were moving forward, pulling the equipment stuck in snowdrift. In the area of Belogori, and our regiment crossed the Don. Having lost contact with their headquarters and fleeing from frost, Hitlerites took coats, blankets, feather beds from the inhabitants of the nearest villages, wrapped themselves in them, stood with raised hands, shouted Hitler, Mussolini kaput. Russian commandant camp. Those who resisted were squeezed into a tight ring of our troops and defeated. The remnants of the troops panikedly retreated, abandoning equipment and military property. Somewhere between Valuiki and Rossosha we received an order, before the approach of the rear army bodies, to take under guard the warehouses of food and uniforms abandoned by the enemy near the district centre Alexievka. We guarded these warehouses for 3 or 4 days. Then the army intendants arrived. And we went on. Everywhere on the roads lay broken enemy equipment. Along the roadsides in the snow lay the corpses of fascist conquerors. The Ostrogozhsko-Rososhanskaya operation was not over yet, as on January 24th the strike group of the Voronezh front troops in cooperation with the left wing of the Bryansk front went on the offensive in the direction of Kastorny. Overcoming fierce enemy resistance, the troops of the two fronts crushed the enemy, advancing to Kursk and Kharkov. We went through the same towns and villages that we left in the summer of 1942. Somewhere on the outskirts of Korocha we received the news that on February 2nd, 1943, the Soviet troops forced the 6th German Army encircled near Stalingrad to capitulate. Its commander Field Marshal Paulus was captured. At one of the halt, this message was brought to the soldiers. Political officer Goncharov finished his speech with the words, "Well, comrades, the holiday has come and on our street." It was a long-awaited and joyful victory of all Soviet people. It was joyful news for all the freedom-loving peoples of the world, to whom it became clear that from now on in the Second World War there comes a sharp turn, which will lead to the inevitable collapse of Hitler's Germany and its allies. On February 5, 1943, the American newspaper New York Herald Tribune posted this message: "The defeat at Stalingrad reminds of the inevitable death of Hitler and his army, which experienced at Stalingrad the greatest catastrophe that has ever fallen on the German army since the existence of Germany. The epic battle for Stalingrad is over. It means that the Nazis have already passed the pinnacle of their power, and now begins their doomed fall. The valiant feat of the Russian army will live in centuries." The border guards discussed the catastrophe of the German armies at Stalingrad with undisguised delight. "Well, that's it, Pyatunin. A border guard respected by all on the outpost," said authoritatively. "Now the Germans are finished." Yes, the main thing now is not to stop, they supported him, to drive them to the border without rest. Beat the fascist bastards without respite. "And we will reach Berlin," added Private Dorokhov, who before the war built the subway in Kiev. "Yes, we will, mark my word." "A prophet too," laughed border guard Vakulenko. "America has opened." "Of course we'll get there. I made a wish about it back in June of the 41st, as soon as the war started. I thought I would never get to Berlin, but now I will."